the Baseball Hall of Fame or the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We've all heard of this concept of a Hall of Fame. Well, Hebrews chapter 11 is what many Christians correctly call the Hall of Faith. It's the hall of remembering those who have walked by faith in the Old Testament, all in order to make the point that we simply continue that legacy today, in that nothing has changed. The only thing God requires of any person is the only thing he has ever required of any person, which is to follow the light that he has given. And we have even more light than they had. We're even more accountable than they were. So bottom line essentially is this: if they can do it, should be even more natural or easier, so to speak, for us to do it. And so this morning, we looked at 4 early Old Testament, pre-Moses, pre-law examples from the Old Testament of walking by faith. We saw Abel and faith worshiping. We saw Enoch and faith walking. We saw Noah and faith working. And we saw Abraham and faith waiting in verses 1 through 19. So tonight, in verses 20 through 40, we first continue to see faith waiting. For you see, Abraham was an example of faith waiting, but just as much so were Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who continued that path of faith waiting. First, we see from verse number 20 the example tonight of Isaac. Look in verse 20. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. So you see, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, just like Abraham did, so also did they. They all died waiting on that same kingdom that Abraham died waiting on. That's the reason why Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are all an extension of waiting on the kingdom. What kingdom? A kingdom that would be filled with their descendants, and a kingdom that would cover the land of Canaan. Now, while many of the promises of God to Abraham did come to pass in the coming of the Old Testament kingdom of Israel, for example, by the time you get to King Solomon, 1,000 years later, by that point, Israel had reached its zenith, and some of God's wonderful promises had at that point been fulfilled. But many of God's promises to Abraham have still not yet come to pass. When are they going to come to pass concerning the kingdom? When the kingdom of Christ comes to earth is when those promises will come to pass. So you see, the coming kingdom of Christ, it will be the ultimate final fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. So you see, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all died waiting on the very same kingdom you and I are still waiting on right now. And unless the rapture happens within our lifetime, we as well will die waiting on that kingdom. But like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we live for something that we might not live to see, but we'll see it after we live. We're still going to see it. Verse 20, now when Isaac blessed Jacob, he thought he was blessing Esau. That's what happened there in verse 20. But it was by faith that he was prophesying of things to come after the death of his children, after his death concerning his children. For you see, in Genesis chapter 27, verse number 29, Isaac says the following to Jacob, quote, nations shall bow to thee. You see, it would be through Jacob that Jesus Christ would come. When Christ comes to earth to rule one day, the nations will indeed bow to Christ, therefore being the fulfillment of bowing to Jacob, for they are bowing to the descendant of Jacob, Jesus. Right now, at this moment, the nations do not bow to Jesus Christ. There are citizens in every nation that bow to Jesus Christ, and they're all part of God's invisible kingdom, but the nations themselves do not bow to Jesus. But Isaiah 9:6 says, the government shall be upon his shoulders. Well, that's going to happen at the second coming of Jesus Christ. So Isaac was prophesying of the coming kingdom of Christ, which would happen long after his death. He also gave Esau a blessing that he would become a great people. That also would happen after Isaac's death. Then we see Jacob in verse 21. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. Jacob had 11 sons. One of Jacob's 11 sons was Joseph. Joseph, as you are probably aware, was rejected by his brothers and he was sold into slavery. But Joseph had faith. Joseph did right no matter what. So God eventually made him second in command of all of Egypt. Joseph was then in a position to save his family from the famine by inviting them all to come live with him in Egypt, including his very elderly father at that point, Jacob. Now, while in Egypt, Joseph had two sons, and the names of the two sons are Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph's two sons and his 10 brothers, they became the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph brought his two sons to his elderly father so that he could bless them just exactly like he and his brother Esau had been blessed by their father Isaac. Now here it says that Jacob leaned on a staff. That's very interesting. When I read Genesis 48, I honestly sort of get the impression that this is a guy like sitting up in bed doing this. But here it says he's leaning on a staff, so he was leaning on a staff. Now, in Genesis 48, it says as well that his eyes were dim. It says that in Genesis 48. Jacob also had a bad leg for many years. That would, besides his age, that would contribute to him leaning on a staff. Wonder why Jacob had a bad leg. That's right, because he wrestled with God, and God touched his thigh. That's why he had a bad leg, and if being old wasn't enough, that's another reason for him to be leaning on a staff. Now, so the point here is that Jacob was weak in the flesh, but yet, it doesn't matter that you're weak in the flesh. He was named Israel. He was a prince with God because he was strong in faith. And it was by faith that Israel, aka Jacob, blessed his two grandchildren concerning things to come. So Joseph brings Manasseh, his firstborn, toward Jacob's right hand, and brings Ephraim, his secondborn, towards Jacob's left hand. And the reason why he did that was so that Jacob could put his right hand on Manasseh, firstborn, in order to give him the superior blessing, and his left hand on Ephraim to give him an inferior, second-rate blessing. And yet, what did Jacob do? Instead, in spite of him having instead of having the one right here and the other right here, instead he crisscrosses his hands like this is what he does. Therefore, still putting his right hand on Ephraim, the second born. Joseph starts to actually move his father's hands. But that's when the father says, "Not so. Ephraim shall be a greater people than Manasseh." Yes, they did. That's exactly what came to pass. Manasseh would become a tiny tribe, so much so that it would be called the half tribe of Manasseh. While meanwhile, Ephraim would become so great and would become so prominent that later, when the kingdom of Israel would split between the 11 tribes in the north and only Judah in the south, the northern kingdom, of which Ephraim was only one part, there are many places in the Old Testament, book of Isaiah being one example, where the northern kingdom isn't called Israel, it's called Ephraim. The whole country is referred to by the name of essentially a state, so to speak, okay? Ephraim would fall into idolatry. Ephraim would fall under God's judgment. Ephraim would be virtually destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. But Zechariah speaks of a day when Ephraim shall be redeemed, and when Ephraim shall enjoy a glorified status during the millennial reign of Christ, or the kingdom. So you see, it all comes around to the coming kingdom of Christ. Isaac and Jacob died looking forward to and waiting on things that would happen after them. Now we come to Joseph in verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. Now, Joseph, we could make a long list of wonderful things to say about Joseph. He was a man of strong faith in countless respects. To tell the story of the life of Joseph is a grand illustration of trusting God indeed. However, the thing brought up here is probably not the first thing that would pop in any of our minds, but yet, because this is all about the future, because this is all about trusting in the unseen, trusting that things will happen even after you are dead, and then living for those things. That's the reason why this particular example is singled out. The example given here is this. Joseph knew that Egypt would not be the permanent home of his people. He was absolutely convinced of that. Yes, I'm the one that brought him here, okay? Joseph could say, I'm the one that brought him here. But this is not going to be their permanent residence. He knew that one day the children of Israel would leave Egypt, would return to the promised land that God had for them, Canaan. For this reason, Joseph said, do not leave my mummy in Egypt. I say mummy because, it's Egypt, and he's in with the Egyptians, so he was probably, mummified, okay? But he says, I'll be a mummy one of these days, but don't leave my mummy in Egypt. When we go home, bring my mummy home with you guys. I want my body to be there too. And that's the reason why today archaeologists can search the sands of the Egyptian desert, and they may very well find the mummies of Amenhotep and Hatshepsut and Ramses and Tutankhamun, but they ain't gonna find Joseph, because Joseph left Egypt with his descendants 400 years after his death. He was saying, Egypt, though I am here now at the moment, and I got work to do here at the moment, God has put me here for the moment, but this is him saying, Egypt is not my home. do not leave my body here. Egypt is not our home either. I think you know I'm not talking about literal Egypt anymore. Egypt is not our home either. This world, in this age, here and now, though, yes, God has you here, this world is not our home. The coming kingdom of Christ, that is our home that we are looking forward to. And I've got great news for y'all. When our exodus out of this world comes and we go home, when the exodus of the church comes in the form of the rapture, unlike Joseph, you won't have to worry about making special arrangements to make sure that your bones go home too. God's going to take care of that. The dead in Christ shall rise first. God will not leave our skeletons in Egypt. Just like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we wait on the coming kingdom. We long for thy kingdom come. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. Then we see faith refusing. Now we come to Moses in verses 23 through 27. Until we go home, we have to live in this world. And that's going to mean resisting temptation. It means refusing offers for us to do wrong, and it means doing right when the hardest thing possible is doing right. First, we see Moses' parents in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Moses' parents feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, even though Pharaoh was visible and God was invisible. What were Moses' parents convinced of? That God holds all human life sacred? By faith, Moses' parents believed that it was more important to please God than it was to play it safe by obeying the king's order. And in Exodus chapter 1, we see there, God had already blessed the faith of the Hebrew midwives for doing the same thing. God had blessed them for refusing Pharaoh's order. And then God blesses the faith of Moses' parents. How does he do that? By delivering their child safely into the hands of Pharaoh's own daughter, and even making it so that Moses' mother ended up getting paid to nurse her own son. God blessed their faith, which had caused them to do the right thing. So also, to the woman, to the girl who experiences an unplanned pregnancy, it will take faith in God for that lady to do the right thing and to keep her baby, to deliver her baby. But if she will have faith, if she too will fear God more than she fears circumstances, God will bless her just like God blessed them. Then we see Moses himself. Look at verses 24 to 27. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. In life, you and I are offered visible things that could be ours at the expense of our faith in the invisible. So the question comes down to, as it always does, which will win? The visible or the invisible? Which will win? Our sight, which will mean the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life? Or will our faith in the invisible things of God prevail? The pleasures of sin, we see that in verse 25. The treasures of Egypt, we see that in verse 26. These things, the pleasures of sin, the treasures of Egypt, these things were visible and they were very, very attractive. Now Moses, the truth is, he would have grown up being aware of his Hebrew origin. I know some different cinematic depictions of the life of Moses have this bombshell moment in which he's a grown-up and finds out one day, I'm adopted? And that's really probably not how it went down. So he knew of his Hebrew origin, but at the same time, he had his adopted Egyptian family. He had his Egyptian education, which would have been an excellent education, even though it would have included all things heathen as well. He had all of the Egyptians' fancies and delights that you could ever want. I remember one time I got to experience laying my eyes on just a little taste of what Moses probably would have been tempted by. And in 2007, the treasures that had been unearthed from the tomb of King Tut were on display in Fort Lauderdale. And I got to go to Fort Lauderdale and see all the golden treasures that were a part of the daily life of King Tut. And that, looking at those amazing golden artifacts and the craftsmanship and the jewels and all of that, all give us a sense of the kind of life that Moses voluntarily gave up when he renounced his Egyptian status and instead embraced his Hebrew status. Just staying Egyptian is all he had to do, but it would have meant continuing to worship the Egyptian gods. It would have meant benefiting from the slave labor of his Hebrew brothers. And it would have meant all the pleasures of beautiful women, golden palaces, delightful food, and endless leisure, as well as maybe, just maybe, to be so reverenced by your fellow Egyptians as to be nearly worshipped as a god yourself. And what if Moses had taken Egypt up on its offer? You know what would have happened? The name of Moses would have been utterly lost to the obscurity of Egyptian history beneath the desert sands. Nobody today would probably know the name Moses. At most, he would be some tiny footnote in some Egyptian record somewhere. But because he chose to believe in the God of Israel, and because Moses chose to suffer with God's people, and he chose to refuse Egypt, because he did that, yeah, we know about Moses. The name of Moses lives on in glory forever. What was Moses convinced of? That God's reward is greater than suffering. That God's reward is worth turning down all the world's offers. Now, verse 26, though, says something interesting. It says Moses chose to suffer, quote, the reproach. The word reproach means shame of Christ. You could look at that and say, how did Moses suffer the reproach of Christ? when Christ wouldn't even be born till 1,500 years after Moses. Because all who suffer with God's people in any time period are suffering the reproach of Christ. For Christ has always been the culmination of what was coming. And so you see, we face the same choice today that Moses or anyone else did. The easy way or the reproach of Christ. The easy way or the reproach of Christ. The forbidden, temporary pleasures of sin, or the eternal reward of choosing to suffer with Christ. Satan puts before us the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And we can choose the easy, visible way of sin or the hard, invisible way of faith. The pleasures that were enjoyed by the Pharaohs, they ended a very, very long time ago. And in spite of all the efforts of those Pharaohs to be buried with all of their golden treasures in hopes of taking them into the afterlife, it didn't work. They did not get to keep any of them. The pharaohs who lived so long ago are today in eternal darkness. But Moses, who made a different choice, Moses is right now enjoying his eternal reward with Christ forever and forever. Will we live for the pleasures of this life, or will we live for the eternal reward of Christ? Then we see faith rescuing in verses 28 and 29. Through faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. Your faith does not solely end up saving you from destruction, but it helps others as well. For example, the men who carried their lame friend to Jesus by lowering their friend through the ceiling. The lame friend was healed, and that was all made possible not solely by the faith of the lame man, but by the faith of the friends. Moses showed them that putting the blood on the doorpost would save their firstborn from God's judgment. Moses himself did that as well. He did it for his house. They saw his faith in practice, and they did the same and were rescued. Then at the Red Sea, when the Israelites were trapped, Moses trusted God entirely, so much so that he boldly declared, "Behold, the salvation of the Lord." And then the Red Sea parted, and Israel crossed on dry land. And then, of course, it collapsed. The water collapsed on the Egyptian army. So you see, Moses believed, they followed his faith, and all of Israel was rescued. So what was Moses convinced of there? That God would rescue the believing, that God would take care of his people. So you see, through our faith, we rescue others. They can't literally be saved by our faith, we know that, but we show them the truth, making it likely that they are saved. Your faith helps rescue others by shining the light that is before them for them to see. All God requires is that we take him at his word. And if we take him at his word by faith, we will wait on the coming kingdom. We will turn down sin and choose to suffer with God's people for Christ, and others will see our faith and be rescued. The only thing God requires is what he always has, the simple element of believing him. As we stand to our feet and sing this hymn of invitation together, as the Lord is speaking to you tonight, come forward and kneel at this altar.